Hello and good evening, everybody. Welcome to Ad America TV. My name is Genara, and I am one of the e-guides here in Ad America. I hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy on this wonderful evening. And if you're new here, Ad America is the U.S. Embassy's American Center, and our mission is to provide a space for young Indonesians to learn more about the United States. This evening's event is called Fight for Our Coral, Reefs, and Climate Change. But before we begin our event today, let's spice things up with a little trivia. Our trivia question for today is: which of the following is an impact of climate change on coral reef ecosystems? Is it A, coral bleaching, B, ocean acidification, C, habitat changes, or D, all of the above? Stay tuned until the end of our event because we will be giving a live shout out for those who can answer the question correctly. Other than that, don't forget to take a selfie and tag at America's Instagram account. Now, before I introduce you to our moderator, let's hear an opening remark from Nicholas Austin, ESTH Officer of the U.S. Embassy, Jakarta. Pak Nicholas Austin, the time is yours.
Halo, saya Nicholas Austin, petugas bagian lingkungan, sains, teknologi, dan kesehatan di Kedubes Amerika Serikat di Jakarta. Senang sekali bisa bertemu Anda semua pada malam ini. With nations coming together at COP26 in Glasgow to address climate change, it's important for us to reiterate the importance of the world's oceans, which are already experiencing negative consequences of climate change, especially coral reefs. Marine and coastal ecosystems offer some of the clearest evidence of our changing climate. Oceans absorb about 90% of the excess thermal energy from climate change, which helps to alleviate some of the warming that we all experience on land. But this also means that oceans are warming, and recent research shows this warming is happening much faster than we previously understood. And particularly relevant to Indonesia, ocean warming and acidification are contributing to a sharp loss in coral reef ecosystems around the world, with about a sixth of cover lost in the last decade alone. Indonesian waters contain more reef area than any other country in the world, and this vital resource provides significant economic benefits to coastal communities. Significant shifts in species distributions have been observed globally, which is leading to conflict over access rights as valuable fish and species, which don't have much interest in arbitrary political boundaries, chase cooler waters closer to the poles or offshore. Further destruction of coral reefs, often the breeding ground and home to many species, will only accelerate this trend. This has consequences for coastal communities, and especially those without access to the political or economic resources to adapt. The United States is committed to addressing the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss with all the tools, assets, and commitment we can assemble. We're working hard to implement President Biden's America the Beautiful initiative, a directive to conserve at least 30% of our land and waters by 2030, and we fully support conserving or protecting at least 30% of the global ocean by 2030. The United States is a committed partner with the Indonesian government and the private sector to protect Indonesia's marine and coastal environment in the Coral Triangle, an area spanning 6 Southeastern Asian countries that's recognized as the single most biologically diverse and ecologically rich region in the world. We continue to work closely with Indonesia's Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries and coordinating Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Investment in these critical issues. Marine protected areas, commonly known as MPAs, are an important part of our efforts. MPAs are critical management tools to conserve biodiversity, safeguard the health of marine ecosystems, and tackle the climate crisis. Protected reefs and MPAs are also better able to withstand the impact of climate change without added pressures from destructive fishing practices, pollution, or harmful development. As part of the Coral Triangle Initiative, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, helped strengthen 8 million hectares of MPAs that support livelihoods and economies. That work in collaboration with Indonesia also led to the declaration of Kai Kecil as an MPA by the Regent of Southeast Maluku. The MPA declaration will help protect the leatherback turtle and empower local communities to be more active in sustainably managing their environment. On both a global and local level, marine and coastal ecosystems such as mangroves, seagrass meadows, and kelp forests have been found to be 10 times more effective at sequestering carbon than on-land forests and should therefore be obvious candidates for conservation. Indonesia is home to more than 20% of the global mangrove cover and is poised to play a significant role in blue carbon investment in coming years. These investments will also help to bolster local resilience to the effects of climate change by contributing to the health of interconnected seagrass and coral reef ecosystems, protecting coastal areas and communities from storm damages and erosion, and maintaining healthy coastal fish stocks. I'll now turn it over to our esteemed moderator, Ganara, to kick off this excellent event. Terima kasih.
Okay, thank you so much, Pak Nicholas Austin, for the wonderful opening remark. And now, without further ado, let's give the warmest welcome to our moderator for today's event, Dr. Hesti Widodo, Senior Program Manager of Coral Triangle Center. Dr. Hesti, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Danara. Good evening, everybody. Selamat malam, selamat datang. Welcome again to Fight for Our Coral Reefs and Climate Change, organized jointly with the Coral Triangle Center or Yayasan Pusat Segitiga Karang based in Denpasar, Bali. My name is Hesti Widodo, and I'll be your moderator for tonight. Coral Triangle Center is a foundation based in Indonesia with regional scope and global impact. Established in 2010, CTC program focused on strengthening leadership and capacity through integrated portfolio of marine protected area learning site in Indonesia and Timor-Leste. We also organize customized training programs and learning networks of women leaders, local government executives, marine protected area practitioners, and facilitation of public-private partnership in the Coral Triangle regions. Since our establishment in 2010 until now, CTC has protected 387,000 hectares of critical marine habitat. We train more than 5,800 people to support marine protected areas and sustainable fisheries management throughout the Coral Triangle region. With our Center for Marine Conservation in Bali, CTC has been visited by more than 13,000 people, many of whom have been inspired to take direct action to support our oceans. Um, Tonight, we're talking about the coral reefs. Coral reefs contain the highest marine biodiversity and ecosystem globally and directly support over 50 million people worldwide, mostly in poor countries. They are among the most threatened ecosystem on Earth, largely due to unprecedented global warming and climate changes combined with growing local pressure. Latest study by the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network in October 2021 reported that between 2009 and 2018, there was a progressive loss of about 14% of the corals from the world's coral reefs. This was primarily due to recurring large-scale coral bleaching event. But interestingly, in the area of East Asian seas in the Coral Triangle showed this different trends with other region. What happened over there? The cover of algae progressively decreased, resulting in an average of 5 times more coral than algae on the coral reefs. That's a little bit background on the coral reefs. And as the warming of planet continues on a global scale, we would like to talk about it. What must be done? What are the priority action that need to be undertaken? Some of this burning question will be discussed by our coral reef expert in the first session tonight. Our first speaker is Ms. Riley Johani. She is the co-founder and executive director of our Coral Triangle Center. She has worked for over 25 years to improve management and financial sustainability of marine protected areas and reduce unsustainable fishing practices in the Southeast Asia. Ms. Johani held several senior positions before in the Nature Conservancy, including as the Coral Triangle Program Director, Country Director Indonesia, and Marine Program Director from 1995 to until 2011. She was part of the core team to help establish the multinational Coral Triangle Initiative for Coral Reefs, Fisheries, and Food Security, or known as CTICFF. She holds a master's science degree in tropical marine ecology from the University of Leiden in Netherlands, and also she holds a master's science in tropical coastal zone management from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in United Kingdom. Her talks tonight will focus on trends in climate change and coral reefs in Indonesia and the Coral Triangle. Our second speaker, Dr. Rodney Salm, he is actually Senior Advisor Emeritus for the Nature Conservancy Pacific Division Marine Program. He is the author of Marine and Coastal Protected Areas, a guide for planners and manager. The book published by IUCN in its third edition in 2000 and has been served as a widely consulted references for researchers and experts on marine conservation. He has 50 years experience in international and marine conservation all over the world. Dr. Nordit Salm is based in Honolulu, Hawaii, and he played a strong role in training and mentoring conservation. His topic will be coral resilience and recovery in Indo-Pacific region. Our third speaker is Professor David Smith. He's a marine biologist who specializes in coral reef system, marine conservation, and designing and directing large scientific programs. He is now Chief Marine Scientist at Mars Corporation, where he focuses mostly on directing the science that underpin their global reef restoration program. Professor Smith has led over 50 scientific expeditions, and he continued to work as professor also at the School of Life Science, University of Essex, and also he's now the adjunct professor at University Hasanuddin. He will be talking about coral restoration, a new hope for corals in the midst of the climate change. We will have the three speakers deliver their topics for a total 45 minutes, which each will talk for 15 minutes. Without further ado, please welcome our first speaker, Ms. Rili Johani. Silakan, Ibu.
Terima kasih, Hesti, and congrats again, yeah, with your promotion, your doctor's title today. So,
Thank you.
selamat malam, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present on coral reefs and climate change. And CTC will organize support 3 sessions on this topic. This is the first one. The second one is with practitioners from the field, and the third one will be more on interactive um, opportunities with the audience to learn more about coral reefs. Next slide, please. So the title is about coral reefs and climate change, and I'd like to start with highlighting the value of coral reefs for us around the globe. Next, please. The Nature Conservancy conducted a study to really estimate the value of coral reefs worldwide. And it's incredible in terms of its value for food production, for food security, for tourism and coastal protection, as well as for medicine. And more than 500 million people depend on the coral reefs worldwide, with an estimated value of 9.9 trillion US dollar. So just to realize what is at stake here in terms of the coral reefs. On top of that, it's one of the most diverse ecosystem in the world, together with the tropical rainforest. The coral reefs cover less than 1% of the Earth's surface, but are home to 25% of all marine fish species. And it's so important to raise the awareness. So CTC joined the International Year of the Reef campaign in 2018, and a beautiful video was produced, which I'd like to show here. Next, please. It's about the biodiversity of the reefs and the threats as well.
For thousands of years, the world's coral reefs have fed us, protected us, sustained life in the world's oceans, and provided life-changing medicines. But time is running out. If we don't act now, every coral reef in the world could be gone within our lifetime. Help turn the tide. The year of the reef. Get involved.
So such documentaries really help galvanize support to preserve the reefs and explain the importance of the reefs for mankind. Next, please. So in 2020, a status of coral reefs of the world report came out, highlighting that coral reefs occur in more than 100 countries and territories worldwide. Worldwide, sorry, while they cover only 0.2% of the seafloor, yet they support at least 25% of all marine species and underpin the safety, coastal protection, well-being of millions of people. As Hesti also highlighted in her introduction, a lot of decline has been recorded in the past 2 decades or so, and particularly under relentless stress from warming and acidification caused by climate change. And although the rates and extent of coral decline is severe, there are signs that some coral reefs can recover if left undisturbed. And another very important um, comment here is that 76% of all the world's coral reef species are found in the Coral Triangle, the highest coral diversity in the world. I will later come back to the Coral Triangle region. Next, please. And I just want to highlight also this very important report, the Climate Change 2021 report, which was really a wake-up call for many countries and citizens around the globe. The UN Secretary General called it, the red coat for humanity. Climate change is such a, defining threat for the next decades for us to concern about, particularly the symptoms we all see around us: extreme heat waves, drought and flood, extreme temperatures. And human behavior is the main cause of the threat of climate change. Next, please. So, what makes a coral reef? It's very important to understand that coral reefs are not stones, but they are sea dwelling animals, and they really constitute colonies of polyps that build coral reefs that shelter and provide habitat for many reef fish and other animals in the reef. They live in symbiosis with zooxanthellae, or very tiny algae that provide also the color of the corals. Next, please. If we look at the impact of climate change that results in rise of sea temperature, and what that means is that the zooxanthellae, because of the rise in temperature, the seawater, they are expelled from the polyps, and that results in a white color of the coral. If the stress continues and the temperature continues to rise, it will eventually lead to the death of the corals, and the coral reefs will be covered by and smothered by algae. There is also a possibility for the coral reefs to rebound when the temperature goes back to normal, and the coral reefs will regain their colors. So white coral reefs, smothered coral reefs with algae, uh, are actually corals that are in stress, or in dead coral for that matter. Next, please. So the coral triangle, coming back to this region, here you see a map with the dark red is constitutes the coral triangle region, harboring the most diverse reefs in the world, with more than 500 species average found in those countries. And the countries include Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. And those 6 countries signed off on an agreement to collaborate together to preserve the coral reefs, called the Coral Triangle Initiative. And this was signed in 2009, leading towards a very strong collaboration across the countries to preserve the coral reefs. Next, please. So Indonesia is at the heart of the Coral Triangle. If you look at our population, it's one of the most populous countries in the world with more than 255 million people. But we also are the largest archipelago in the world with more than 17,000 islands and a coastline of more than 95,000 kilometers. Coral reef area stretches across 51,000 square kilometers. So Indonesia has a huge area of marine biodiversity and a great responsibility to help preserve among the most diverse ecosystems in the world. Next, please. So recognizing also the epicenter of marine biodiversity, we set up the CTC in 2010, really dedicated to build up local capacity in this geography in the Coral Triangle, hence our name, the Coral Triangle Center. As Hesti said, we're based in Bali, but our program stretches out to Indonesia and the other 5 countries in the Coral Triangle. Our mission is really to help build up local capacity to care for the coastal and marine ecosystems and inspire generations to become stewards of the oceans. Next, please. So we also promote or support this aspiration of protecting 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. And this is now worldwide, and certainly the upcoming G20 conference will also support this ambition. They signed a leaders declaration in Rome in October last year to support this initiative to set aside 30% of the ocean's waters in marine protected areas and help protect the most diverse ecosystems around the globe. Next, please. Now, as you also mentioned, CTC is focused very much on establishing and supporting marine protected areas in the Coral Triangle. At this stage, we support 7 sites, including Nusa Penida, MPA offshore Bali, very famous for its iconic species, the mola, as you see here, and the Banda Islands, very remote areas in the Banda Sea, where we focus more also on strengthening local marine tenure systems and work with local communities in preserving those coastal ecosystems around those islands. So these are very different sites and very different approaches to management. And we learn a lot by comparing and also learning from those sites with the stakeholders involved. And the second session next week will focus more on the field perspectives from the communities and others, how they go about preserving the reefs. Next, please. We also support new MPAs like Guano and Maluku, Sula, and the Lirase Islands. With support from USAID, we were part of the Sea Project and helped establish those 3 MPAs and build up the local capacity of communities, develop MPA champions, and also a special focus on women engagement. And we support 2 MPAs, marine protected areas in Timor-Leste, in Ottawa Island and Nikisa. Next, please. Yeah. The coral rehabilitation is also integral part of our work. Here's an example, Nusa Penida, where we work with a local community group to help restore the coral reefs in Nusa Penida using the Reef Star method from Mars. And David will talk more in detail about Mars's work on this, groundbreaking work on this method and how they help recover reefs throughout Indonesia and other areas in the world. We also have an adopted coral program where our families, friends, our tourists and visitors can help plant a baby coral and monitor the growth of the coral over time. Next, please. And in conclusion, I'd like to highlight also our Center for Marine Conservation in Bali, which is now completed. This is really meant to be an place where people can meet and learn in a fun way about coral reefs and ocean conservation. For example, we have 2 escape rooms. Next, please. For those who do not know what an escape room is, it's like you go in with a few friends or your family into a space and you have to resolve puzzles to get out. And the theme here is to save the coral reefs in 1 hour or to save the turtles from the plastic pollution in 1.5 hours. And it's a great way, a fun way to learn more about the diversity, the threats, and the solutions related to ocean issues. And we've had so many guests coming through, and they really learned a lot about this topic in a very effective way. So our third session for America in 2 weeks, we will actually have a sort of escape room experience online that we can offer to the audience and engage you in this way on coral reef conservation. We also have, for example, the Wayang Samudra, the Wayang, the shadow puppets. It's of course a century-old tradition to communicate really great stories at the community level. And we developed ocean puppets and performed these at the communities, but also at our center, again, to bring home the message of the threats and the solutions and open up a dialogue how we can all be part of saving the oceans and particularly address the issues of climate change. And here you see a few photos of the groups that come through, schools, friends, students, visitors. We have so many groups coming through, and we hope to all welcome you at some stage to Bali and enjoy our fun learning experiences there. So then I'd like to leave it here and looking forward to your questions after this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ibu. Really, it is very interesting. I hope everybody also got a chance to visit our center in Bali. As Ibu really also mentioned, Wayang Samudra, the ocean shadow puppet or puppet, ocean puppet, will be a good performance to see, and also it resembles our heritage in Indonesia. So we will continue with the next speaker, which is Dr. Rodney Salm. Our team, please be ready for this. Please welcome Dr. Rodney Salm presentation.
Selamat malam, selamat datang ke presentasi ini. Saya minta maaf karena saya akan berbicara dalam bahasa Inggris. Hello everybody, good evening and welcome. I will start with a look at resilience and to remind ourselves a little about it. And this is the ability of a community to both resist stress and recover quickly from it. In this case, I will be looking specifically at coral communities and how they respond to global ocean warming and the related heat stress. There are various ways we can recognize the ability of a coral community to resist stress. And the slide at the top left-hand side shows a number of these very well. In that slide, you'll see that there's very high cover of living coral. That's a good sign of resilience of that community because it indicates that corals have been able to grow and continue growing and reproduce and repopulate areas that are damaged to maintain a high level of coral cover over decades, many, many decades. Also in that slide, you will see that there are table corals, branching corals of different kinds, and the rounded domes of smaller massive corals. And in all the nooks and crannies, there will be other corals too. So, and that high diversity that we see is important because it brings redundancy into the community. And by that, I mean that if a coral is taken out, if there's one that's particularly susceptible to any one stress or another and disappears from that system, there are other corals that can fill that role and function in the system. We also look for the presence of disease. If there's a high incidence of disease, it's not a good sign. It's a sign that there's probably water pollution or other things that are stressing the corals and that the coral's immunity is low. If there's no or low disease, it's a good sign. It means the corals are healthy. They're able to keep disease at bay. And so that's something we look for. We also look to see if there are active growth margins on the corals. And if you look at the coral, the table coral on the left-hand bottom side, you will see that there's a margin to the table, a pale margin. That's about a 2 centimeter pale margin, which is the growing strip of that coral colony. And it tells us it's actively growing, which is a very good sign. And we would expect that from that coral because it has a deep, healthy coloration. And so it's got the energy stored up in the cells to be able to devote to active growth. You can see it too in the branching coral to the left of that table coral. And we also look for a range and size classes, because a range and size classes, such as we see here with a small table coral in the bottom left, larger table coral in the bottom right, and the larger one still in the background. It tells us that over time, as corals die, the dead areas are being settled, and there's a constant dynamic of growth, death, settlement, growth, reproduction, death in the coral community. We also look for that the color of the corals. Deep colors tell us the corals are healthy. It's a sign of stress when the corals begin to lose their color and pale and brighten and whiten and eventually bleach completely and then starve to death. So we look for good color. It tells us the corals have good fat deposits. They're generating good fat deposits, and they're able to draw on those energy reserves to help them deal with stress. Also, big old corals, such as the one on the bottom right, which is about 70 or 80 years old. It's a huge table coral, maybe the biggest one in the world for all we know. Um, that coral has been around for that period of time, and it tells us that the community in which it is growing has been resilient over that period of time too. Um, these table corals are very susceptible to bleaching, to disease, to predation from crown of thorns and other things, and to damage from people too, such as from anchors or careless divers. So it's a really good sign to find something like that, and something that keeps us very happy, of course. And those large coral colonies have prodigious larval production, which helps the damaged areas of reefs to recover. We also look for these massive corals, the big old massive corals. Now, this one's been around a while. It's more than 3 meters high, and so likely more than 300 years old. So for that period of time, the conditions have supported this vigorous coral growth. It's a healthy coral colony. It's showing no signs of disease or other problems. Um, so it is a very good indicator of the resilience of this particular coral community. And these corals are important as they form the pillars or the foundations for coral reef development. We can see good signs of recovery potential of coral communities right across the Indo-Pacific. The most obvious of these are baby corals settled on old dead areas. Where we see many recruits, especially with many recruits of different species, it's a good indicator of the resilience of that system and its ability to recover. In the picture at the top left, you will see indeed many and diverse coral recruits settled on an old dead table coral. And the surface of that coral is clean, it's got no sediments, got no algae, provides a good substrate for coral larvae to settle. It also tells us that there are good herbivores that are able to graze down the algae and keep the surface of that coral clean. It probably also tells us that there's good water quality, and where there are pollutants washing into and over this reef, we would expect to see dense algal growth. And the algal growth prevents corals settling on these dead surfaces, and it would abrade these small corals and prevent them from successfully recruiting and growing up into adults. The other thing we look for is the ability of corals to repair damage. Corals sustain frequent damage from bites from fish, for example. Waves may throw other pieces of rubble onto corals and cause a small abrasion. These lesions are repaired easily by healthy corals. And also, there are larger areas that have been killed off by predators, such as crown of thorn starfish. Those areas, if corals are healthy, they're able to overgrow them and regain and recover that coral colony from the bits that survived the predation. Those dead areas of coral are often settled by competitors such as sponges in particular and algae, and a healthy coral colony that does have good energy reserves can fight off and displace those competitors and help that dead area to recover. This slide takes our view of resilience to a different scale. It comes from the NOAA Coral Reef Watch site, and it's giving us an idea of how water temperature forms a mosaic over vast areas, such as Indonesia and the neighboring countries. And indeed, it would be the same right across the Indian Ocean to the East African coast and across the Pacific. What we're looking at is the red areas have highest temperatures and the higher risk of coral bleaching. The orange areas are intermediate levels of temperature and bleaching risk, and the yellow areas are very low probability of bleaching, where water temperatures are just a little bit above the average summer maximum. And the clear areas shown here as blue, the water temperature is normal and there's no bleaching risk at all. The positive thing we can see is how, in fact, there's a mosaic of heat stress over the reefs of this area, and that there are some areas where bleaching is likely and possibly even mortality, but there are many areas where bleaching risk is very low and where the corals will survive to reproduce, provide the larvae needed to help those areas that succumb recover strongly again. And that's one way of interpreting it, this image, and drawing hope from it. Another area is to look at those tongues of blue water that are flowing into Indonesia. Up in the middle of the upper middle part of that slide, you see a tongue of blue water or cool water coming in to the Straits of Makassar between Kalimantan and Sulawesi. And on the east side of Sulawesi, between Sulawesi and Halmahera, there's another tongue of water coming in from the Philippines. And between Halmahera and Papua, another tongue coming in towards the Raja Ampat Islands. That flow of water is a consistent flow of water that's linked to a phenomenon known as the Indonesia through flow. And it happens because the water of the West Pacific up in the right quadrant, top right quadrant, is higher in sea level than it is in the lower left quadrant, where the sea level at the east part of the Indian Ocean is lower. So we've got high water at the top right of Indonesia, low water in the bottom part of Indonesia, and a strong flow of water consequently through Indonesia, bringing in water from the Pacific and bringing in larvae from the Pacific, from Sabah, Malaysia, from the Philippines, from Papua New Guinea into Indonesia, where these larvae are able to settle in the Indonesian reefs and then use these as stepping stones to produce larvae that then move down into East Timor and Northern Australia. And so that we can draw hope from this. We can draw hope in two ways. One, that there's good mixing through the system and a mosaic of stress that's going to affect the reefs in the area. But what it tells us is that we need to look at reef management beyond sites and beyond the community level, such as I emphasized in the previous slides. And we need to think of managing reefs in networks that cross national boundaries. Here we've got 5 countries all interconnected by the Indonesia through flow and larval distribution through that area and so on. And we need to think of working at that level of collaboration to achieve effective resilience of the entire system. And fortunately, the Coral Triangle initiative is in place and provides a vehicle to achieve that kind of collaboration. There's a great deal of coral resilience research happening around the world, and a great deal of understanding about resilience in corals that is happening. And people are understanding how corals are being able to resist stress And they do it at various levels, right down to microbiology, where they're looking at the genes, genetic structure of corals, and which genes can help corals, give them the strength they need and the ability to be able to resist heat stress. And it's very clear that some corals are able to resist heat stress, even in a community of mixed corals where some species of the same, some individuals of the same species react differently. I saw this clearly in 2009 in Mozambique, where there was a vast area of a certain kind of table coral mixed in with other species. And the table corals were, there was bleaching, I should say, all around. But these table corals, some of them were dark brown and unstressed. Some of them were sort of mustard colored and clearly suffering stress. And others were already bleached white and extremely stressed. And so in one species of coral, we saw the whole spectrum from susceptibility to heat stress through some resistance ability and some complete resistance to heat stress. When I went back, by the way, in 2010, the whole community had recovered and there was no sign of any stress at all, which was heartening. And so some coral communities can be more resilient. And the case that I've just spoken to illustrates that in some way. But some coral communities may lose a good number of corals, but the community will bounce back after the stress event is gone, and that there will be corals that come in and settle the dead areas and recover. And so you may see a change in the structure of the coral community, but it will still function. It will still retain its functions and values. And things that contribute to this community resilience are things such as oceanography, as I mentioned, through the flows that come in from the Indonesia through flow, to geomorphology, where you have shallow areas of reef which might be more susceptible and succumb easily, and steep reefs that go to great depths where the corals deep down survive and reproduce and repopulate the shallower areas when they succumb to stress. And also there are areas where corals live very narrowly in their comfort zone. So temperatures don't change much at all. And those coral communities may, in fact, may be more susceptible to heat stress because they've never experienced it. But in other areas, there are coral communities that are thriving in areas where the temperature varies annually as much as 5 degrees or more centigrade. And so those corals are already hardened to temperature change, and they may well be able to resist heat stress. Time will tell. So the bottom line is that corals do survive. Coral community structure changes, as indeed it has from the beginning of time, and that we need to focus on the survivors. So we need to find out where those resilient pockets of coral communities are, embed them deeply into our protected area systems, and use them as the foundations for the design of protected area networks that cover vast areas, including the whole of the Coral Triangle. And if we do that, then I think we have a very strong chance that corals will survive and that they will be mutually replenishing, that there will be change in the structure, but the corals reefs will persist as functional systems that bring benefits to people. Terima kasih. Thank you.
Terima kasih, Pak Rod. Although Pak Rod is actually presenting pre-recorded video, but if you have any questions for Dr. Rodney Salm, please send us questions through Zoom, Facebook, Twitter, or our other at America social media, and that we can pass it to Dr. Rodney Salm and answer your questions. It is interesting from the video of Professor Dr. Rodney Salm that we learn about the resistance of coral, and the resistance indicator actually, if we found a hard coral life, the high diversity, low the seas, and also the coral show good colors, then it will be a good coral reefs area. Before we go into our next presentation, there's a one video of the reef health monitoring conducted by CTC. Ibu really will guide us through this video for 30 seconds. Ibu really, are you ready to show the video?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, this video was left behind, but it actually is a good follow-up on Rod Salm's presentation. So the video, please go ahead. I will narrate through the video. It's a very short video taken at the Banda Islands and shows us how we actually monitor the reef with the transect method. Here you see our team in action. We take data every 2 years at the same place, same location, same time at shallow depths from 3 to 5 meters and from 8 to 10 meters. And we measure the dead corals, the live corals, the coverage, also sandy areas, algae, uh, specific features like Parrot said, if there's a colony of corals that is very big, we will also record that. And this type of information is critical for the management and protection of reefs because it gives us an idea how the corals are doing. It helps you assess the health of a coral reef and whether there are issues of bleaching or anchor damage. And the management unit, the communities can then help intervene accordingly. And we help train communities, local governments, as well as dive operators in taking data with us and help them train in coral and fish monitoring exercises. So this was just an additional information prior to David's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Burili. It is interesting from the first and second presentation, we learn about the coral, which is animal, and also coral needs effort to protect. And also we will go into the next presentation presented by Professor David Smith about coral restoration, a new hope for corals in the midst of climate change. Professor David, please come to the
Thank
stage.
you. Thanks very much, Dr. Heston. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for inviting me tonight. I'm just going to share my screen and then we'll get going. Okay, so really interesting talks so far about different aspects of coral reefs and the threat they're under, and also what we're doing as a community to try and help. But also from Dr. Salm, this sort of window of hope that there is opportunity to reverse the trend in global reef loss. And really that's the focus of my talk. It's a different type of conservation. And I'll run through this process of coral restoration before talking to you specifically about some of the work we've done as Mars for the last decade in collaboration with lots of different institutes. So the first point really, and let's focus on this green box here. Here I'm going to sort of introduce you to the concepts of restoration. Now restoration is a tool, another conservation tool in the wider conservation toolbox. And as Patrick said to start with, one of the major things that we need to do as a society, of course, is to better protect our coral reefs. And the 30 by 30 initiative is one way to do that. So that's the sort of major framework of protection. But there are reefs around the world that unfortunately have been degraded to such an extent that they've lost their ability to recover. And we've seen this in many different places around the world. There, we need a more direct intervention to reverse that trend. And the premise of restoration is to provide an opportunity for the coral reef to get back to its best possible state. Because as we heard before from Ibarili as well, and also Dr. Salm, coral reefs that are in the best possible conditions stand the best possible chance of surviving future events. So think of it as giving the system all the opportunity to get in its best physical condition to survive future events. And that's what the act of restoration really does. If we look at the blue block here, what we really say is that we're facilitating natural recovery. So think about a system and a coral reef that has been so impacted over so many years that it's lost its ability to recover, maybe because there is no larvae flowing into the system to bring new corals in, or maybe the very physical structure of the habitat itself has been destroyed, so it can no longer hold corals. And a good example of this, or a bad example, unfortunately, would be reefs that have suffered blast fishing over many years. And what we see there is that the seafloor itself turns from being a hard, complex surface to one that is dominated by loose rubble. And that loose rubble, if it doesn't bind together, unfortunately prevents corals settling and regenerating, even if there is a supply of larvae. It's those sort of locations where restoration can play a very important role. And of course, in terms of what we try to do, I'll go here onto the yellow box, is to minimize our physical intervention. So though we're actively getting involved and helping to rebuild a reef, we want to do that in a very minimalistic way. And what we aim to do is do the minimum to kickstart the natural ecological processes of recovery, get that system back to a point where it can recover itself. And that way we become very cost effective in time and resources if we really want to restore at scale. And that scale question is the big issue, and cost is a big issue in the world of restoration, because any time you put scuba divers in the water, or you need intensive labor to do something, then obviously costs go up. So this active intervention and conservation really needs to consider the sort of efficiencies of which you can deliver a restoration project, and much of our activity is focused on that. The other way of thinking about this is what sites can you restore in small pockets that will have maximum benefit to other wider areas? And certainly that's another approach that we need to consider. We think about it as what's the ecological footprint of your restoration compared to your physical footprint? Where do you get biggest bang for your buck? And that's another consideration for restoration. And the final point, and one I want to focus on, because I think our previous speakers have raised this issue as well, is how do we future proof our restoration? Why would we put lots of resources and effort into restoring a site that is only going to be impacted by the next big climate event? So there we really need to take into consideration restoring resilient reefs. And there's a few ways that you can think about this, as our previous presenters have talked about. What Dr. Salm talked about, I actually talked about all three of these, which is great, set the talk up very nicely. But the his first comment really was about finding these areas around the world that have a natural ability to withstand or resist future climate change, or they're less vulnerable to future climate change due to oceanography, currents, upwelling, complex topography of reefs. In some sites, for example, even though surface waters may be heated, there is internal mixing that mixes that hot surface water with cooler waters, which brings temperatures down. Those areas are often called refuge environments. And there's been some great work around the world that are trying to identify sites that could possibly be refuge environments based on these sort of issues. That one of these projects, many really fantastic scientists have worked on, is the Vibrant Oceans Project, or the 50 Reefs Project. If you see here in the top right, this indicates some locations where these resilient reefs may be. These are the sites that maybe we want to focus on. Or it's certainly one school of thought is to focus on those areas when you're putting direct conservation action in place. They might be the last refuge, if you like, of reefs as we enter this really critical time of climate change. The previous speaker also talked about the fact that there are species out there that we know are more resistant to temperature, temperature being the major threat at the moment due to coral bleaching, as been previously discussed. But we know even in the most dire consequences, when reefs are really heated up, there are species that survive. In a restoration setting, do we actually want to use those survivors and try and increase their abundance by putting them back out onto degraded systems? So species resistance is something that we take into consideration. And finally, we also consider those individuals of a single species that may be more resistant than others in that population. That generally tends to be due to the coral changing its natural microbiota. It's zooanthely, as Ibu really spoke about, or it might be the microbes on the outside. But for whatever reason, those particular individuals in that population are more robust. Now, the art of restoration maybe, or resilient restoration, would be to get those genotypes and increase the abundance of those genotypes on the reef so you have a net positive impact of reef resilience. So there's loads of different ways we can think about the climate change debate and restoring coral reefs. All this power sort of is insignificant, of course, if we don't start to get climate change under control in the next few decades. So the second part of my talk, I want to give you some examples of what we've done in Indonesia. This project is a collaborative project, lots of organizations. It was initiated through Mars, um, and we really started quite early on in the 2000s, but it really sort of kicked off in 2011. And a problem was posed to a team in Indonesia, the Mars team in Indonesia. Was it possible to rebuild coral reefs in certain locations? And these locations are these vast areas of many parts of coral reef systems in Southeast Asia. It's not unique to Indonesia. They have had historical blast fishing or other physical disturbance, and the habitat has been converted into these big, vast rubble beds. And these rubble move around and stop the settlement of coral, and you don't get any recovery. So this particular restoration process was developed to deal with that specific problem. And the process that was developed was the production of what we call these reef stars, which Ibn really also briefly mentioned. These are hexagonal steel structures used in different ways, which are coated with coralline sand, which is taken from the site of restoration and acts as a suitable substrate to allow coral larvae to attach and grow. And onto each of these frames, you attach corals of opportunity, corals that have been selected or collected from the sort of adjacent reefs, arguably those resilient corals. These reef stars are placed underwater and attached to each other to form a large web structure that sits on top of the rubble, is anchored in, and that web provides a very strong, stable structure for corals to grow. The corals are lifted slightly off the seabed, which puts them in a really great environmental setting to encourage rapid coral growth. Corals grow up, they grow down, they consolidate the rubble, and you get some quite remarkable results. So that's the actual physical act of restoration. Now, in order to make this more efficient and deal with the scalability, what Mars did, and I suppose it's from the background of what that industry and organization is all about, is look at this in a sort of supply chain approach. So they identified all the different steps in this restoration process, from the fabrication and the sourcing of the steel that's used for the reef stars, all the way through to what was needed to put the corals onto the reef stars and the reef stars onto the seabed. And they divided that process up into 10 steps. They then trained local community members of the islands in which we were working on in specific groups to deliver each of those tasks. And then, of course, through repetition, those groups become really effective at delivering, an expert in delivering those tasks. You glue that together, again, in a supply chain type approach, and you end up with a really fast, scalable, rapid restoration process. And to give you an idea, our team of 4 divers, supported by the community who sort of manufactured the reef stars, can deploy up to 5, in some cases 7 or 8,000 corals in a day's diving. And in Indonesia, in the Spimondi archipelago, which is the focal point, there's been 40,000 meters squared of reef restored, over 300,000 corals deployed in a very rapidly. What that supply chain thinking also does, and the involvement of different community groups, is diversify the types of individuals who are involved in the restoration. And we know that participation in a conservation action has much better outcomes. So we have lots of different groups of the community involved in the active restoration, from monitoring and evaluation again to cleaning and manufacture of reef stars. And that's been a really positive group. In a restoration activity with using this approach, we might have 60 or 70 individuals from the community directly involved, spread across the whole community, not just those who are comfortable in the water. The pictures on the right here show our success from going from a coral rubble field to the reef stars to a developed coral reef, which you can see on the bottom right there. So the future for us really is to pass on what we have learned through trial and error, and also on the ground in the Spimonde to other areas around the world. And I'm delighted to say that we work very closely with CTC and will capitalise on their expertise, experience of training, capacity building, and different groups to set up this hub and spoke model. The hub here is our site in Spimonde where we restore, and we invite stakeholders to our restoration site to learn on the ground how to actually restore a reef. It's more complicated than it seems, but it's also obviously quite effective. These teams then go back out to wherever they are restoring and deploy the technique at those locations. And the program that we work with very closely with CTC is working closely with the Indonesian National Park authorities. So these spokes here will be different marine national parks. What we've also done, I think, which is really important, is to develop a coral task force, which is made up of CTC employees combined with Mars. And this task force is a group of really experienced and well-trained individuals who then go back out to the different sites, these spokes, or in this case, the national parks, and not oversee, but actually discuss the issues of restoration with the national parks, see how it's going, answer any questions, see if there are any problems, and importantly, obtain any best practices, which are then brought back to the hub, they're synthesized and passed out to other spokes. This means that the whole network is communicating amongst each other. It's a living, learning environment, there's continual capacity development, and it's a great way of making sure best practices and also problems are spread. These techniques, this hub and spoke model is pioneered in Indonesia. Obviously, that's our most advanced site. But we're now setting up hubs in different parts of the world in those two key different ecoregions, out in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, and the Great Barrier Reef and Ningaloo Reef, in the Central Indian Ocean, and soon to be the Western Indian Ocean. So several of these sites, forming several of these networks are being produced, and these networks will start talking to each other so we can all learn as a community. Of course, all this activity is supported by a quite complex and advanced research program, which really is aimed at making sure what we do is sustainable, that when we do restore, we restore taking into consideration the value to local communities. How can we maximize that value? It might be, for example, that restoration is needed in a particular area to help coastal protection. Does that require a different type of technique? How can we incorporate the latest understandings of climate resilience into a restoration? And how do we get to the next level to make sure we can reverse this terrible trend of reef loss and also prevent coral reefs from disappearing from our planet over the next 10 years? Is that close? So let me end with just two images. This is an image of a site out in the Spimonde archipelago, which we would consider needs restoring. It's got no recovery over a 30-year period. You can see our transect lines here monitoring that. Loose roll beds, no diversity. And this is the adjacent reef that has been restored just after a 4-year period. You can just see the reef stars. Well, you can barely see the reef stars in the white arrow because they can be integrated into the reef structure. If you want any more information, please go to the website so you can see listed there. And thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor David Smith, for this presentation. Interesting. So we learned something over it. We know the method of coral restoration that you explained, the reef stars, and also based on your latest talk that you mentioned, the methods that actually should be designed based on the characteristic of the area and also the purpose of the coral restoration itself. So, Bapak, Ibu, teman-teman, rekan-rekan semua, we have been into the 3 presentations. Now is actually the question and answer sessions for us. Before we go into the questions, let me a little bit summarizing a string of learnings of this 3 presentation. I believe by the end of this 3 presentation, we know the coral is sea-dwelling animal, lives in colony, and coral lives coexistence in symbiotic mutualism with macroalgae called Zooxanthellae. When triggered with higher temperature, the algae may be expelled. Therefore, we call it coral bleaching. That's the condition of the coral bleaching. And a coral resilience is key to recognize the survivor in extreme situation to sustain coral reef ecosystem. And managing the coral reef beyond country boundaries is important to achieve global coral resiliency, as Dr. Rodsal mentioned in his presentation. And for the last one, we have um, Dr. Professor David Smith focus on survivors triumvirate or refugee species and genotypes for coral restoration is very important. Before we go into the social media questions, um, let's go into the question first for maybe for Ibu Rili. We have a question like, as the warming of the planet continues on the global scale, what does it mean for coral reefs in Indonesia and the Coral Triangle? Maybe Ibu Rili would like to answer this related some of our effort in Indonesia and the Coral Triangle, Bu.
Thank you, Hesti, and thank you also, David, for your great presentation. I think for the global warming for the Coral Triangle region is a real problem because there are so many coral reef areas in the Coral Triangle, and it's an epicenter for marine biodiversity, and for sure, areas will be impacted by climate change. But as Parot also said, Dr. Rod Salm, we are actually lucky in the Coral Triangle with the Indonesia through flow and the many upwelling areas that the Coral Triangle has. So upwelling areas are places where cold water from the deep come to the surface and actually help deflate the sea temperature rise at certain areas. For example, in Nusa Penida, we have upwelling areas as well. So that helps deflate the impact of climate change and keeps literally the coral reefs cool. And so they can actually withstand, climate change better than other areas. And so it's very important to identify and include those upwelling areas when we design marine protected areas for its protection. And another factor why the Coral Triangle might be more resilient to climate change is the sheer diversity of reefs that we find here. So, as Dr. Rotsam explained, the more diverse a reef, the more resilient it is to withstand disturbances like um, climate change. So, you can also imagine some with such diversity, more species will be um, affected, others are more able to withstand this threat and so-called the survivors. And so there is more, I think, resilience in the Coral Triangle to withstand climate change. So what it means for the Coral Triangle is that we still have to be very vigilant in identifying and protecting those very resilient reefs throughout the Coral Triangle, and definitely recognize its role in helping to replenish other coral reef areas in the Asia Pacific region and worldwide. So, um, hence also the establishment of our foundation, the Coral Triangle Center, to ensure that we dedicate, our efforts in building capacity across the region to help with this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Burili. So, like, actually, there's also answering several questions related to why the coral reefs and the coral triangle is resilient compared to others. So let's go to a question from Dina, uh, no, from Arini through Instagram. I think this is related to Ibu Rili presentation on bringing up the youth to learn more or care for their natural resources. What should I do as individual to protect coral reefs? Begitu pertanyaannya Bu Rili dari Arini.
Oh, great question, Arini. Thank you for that. Well, what you can do individually is if you like, to go to the sea, like to swim, snorkel, dive, just to ensure that you have a good code of conduct, not to trample on the reef, take corals out of the sea, ensure that we don't litter plastics on the beach. Of course, a lot of the pollution issues in the oceans are land based. So we all can help a lot if we all help reduce the amount of plastics going into the sea. That's already, a great effort. You can imagine everyone of us will actually put the plastics in bins and ensure they are processed well. that will already be very helpful. It's also great if you can help organize beach cleanups or adopt a coral, for example, help replanting corals, raise the awareness on the importance of coral reefs. We can also provide you slides that you can show at schools, for example, or with other groups in your neighborhood. So I think you can also become a champion for coral reefs in your own right by raising the importance of protecting coral reefs and help. Everyone can really help with this, and it's so relevant for our future because our food, our oxygen, our future really depends also on oceans. So it's a matter that is relevant to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Burili. So everybody should take their role to take care of our marine and oceans. And just to remind everybody that actually we're going, including Indonesia, is actually in the world now agreed to protect 30% of the marine ecosystem by 2030. So we are in a race for 2030, 30 by 30 for making sure our ocean and planet are protected. And we go into the next question. It's going to be for Professor Smith. Um, as you as you has already mentioned about new and innovative technologies in coral reef restoration, would you mind to elaborate some of the methodology, and maybe you can repeat what is the consideration in choosing the technology to adopt?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. And I'll just cover two other points, if that's okay, just in support of what Iba really also said, in terms of the importance of the coral triangle and what climate, the impacts of climate change. The other way of thinking about this is that because the coral triangle and particularly Indonesian reefs are so biodiverse and so expansive, then the global significance of Indonesian reefs is going to get even bigger as we go through time and reefs around the world shrink. And that's going to really shine a spotlight on Indonesia. It's going to be one of the last refuges. It's really going to be important. And I'd also provide my support of Ibarili's comments to the the other question that it's the youth of today is going to have to be the ambassadors going forward to make a difference because it's only 10 to 15 years before we could lose all reefs. It's on our watch and on their watch, and we will do everything we can to support her on that. In terms of reef restoration, there's lots of different techniques, and the most important thing to understand about reef restoration is that there's not one single technique that works across all systems. As we've heard from our talks, reefs are extremely diverse um, biologically, but also physically. So the type of technique that you would use, and I'll listen for listeners in a second, depends really on the structure of the habitat. So let me just give you an example. So where we have these loose rubble beds that I introduced in my presentation, then there you need to put corals, which you're doing in restoration, putting the corals back into the system, on structures that overrides that mobile substrate. So there's a couple of ways to do that. You can put the reef stars together and you put corals on those reef stars to stop them wobbling around. Others have suggested putting nets over the rubble to consolidate the rubble to prevent it wiggling around, and that's been effective in some places. Other systems around the world, including Indonesia, don't have that problem of loose rubble, that have lots of bare, hard rock. Well, you don't need to put reef stars on those hard rocks. There, you generally attach corals directly to the rocks. And there's a few different ways to do that. If you have branching corals, these beautiful complex structures that support so much biodiversity, there are specific coral clips, for example, that you can buy, and you can very quickly attach the actual fragment to the rock. So that's like a direct attachment. Obviously, you're doing one at a time, so it can be labor intensive. The other approach that's been used in on these hard substrates and uh, for species similar to what Dr. Salm showed, that big sort of old coral, big dome shaped, is a process called microfragmenting, and that's been really successful in many places. Small colonies about this sort of apple size have been broken up into pieces and spread out. And because the tissue is damaged, it grows really quickly. And then the different fragments grow into each other to produce a much larger colony. And size is really important when it comes to the ability of a coral to reproduce. So that's been very effective. But that needs to be done by someone who's extremely well trained. We don't want people to go around smashing up corals. But that's certainly a process. And the final one I'll mention, just to cover all bases, is what we call larval reseeding. And that's where, when corals go through their reproductive stage, it produces lots of eggs and sperm. They fertilize externally mostly, 75% of the time, produce these larvae, which then roam around and find a suitable place to settle. Well, there are projects around the world which have collected that larvae and directed it to the reefs that need most help. And that larval reseeding is quite a cost-effective way of delivering the recruitment of larvae where it's needed. For all these techniques, there are pros and cons. Our approach, and particularly in those hubs that I identified, is to train our individual groups on all of those techniques so that the individual stakeholders in those groups can decide what's the most effective technique to use into that set of environmental conditions. And I would say that was probably where we're at the moment.
Thank you. So very important to understand in which condition you apply that technology, yeah, Professor David.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have the next question from Swamintaya, I think from the Zoom room. Based on the fact that our seas and oceans are large and still mysterious, do you think until now there are a lot of many corals with still unknown? Who will be answering this, Ibu Rili or Professor David?
Well, I'm happy to give a few ideas that I think a great question also. Um, I think definitely, there's still a lot of animals out there that we do not know yet from the oceans. It's one of the most unexplored areas perhaps in the world because it's so difficult to identify all the species that could be in the oceans. They are so vast. And recently, there was this great reef discovered at Tahiti, for example. We're also looking at, you know, deep deeper coral reefs, in the Mesozone, they call it, around between 50 to 100 meters. You can also still find deep sea corals, for example, and they haven't all been identified yet. So I think there's still so much more to explore in the deeper zones. So many corals, but also other fish species, other species in general. So it's still a big discovery for us, and I think even more so important to really protect the oceans from pollutions, particularly from the micropollutants that really slowly poisons, everything in the oceans as they take in those micropollutants in their food and in their tissues. And in turn, we are also eating seafood. And so it's really a vicious circle. And we have to break it both from a climate change perspective, but also from a pollution perspective, particularly plastic pollution, and also the overfishing. Those are three key threats we need to address. And before we actually lose so many animals that we don't even know are there in the oceans. So thanks so much for that question.
Thank you, Burili. So interesting about the unknown of the corals, the deep sea one. Um, let's go. We still have quite enough time. We're going to go into the next questions um, from Izat Nugraha. From this presentation by the speakers, he's actually curious why most of the presentation of the coral restoration is focused only to hard corals. How about the soft corals? Maybe Professor David can answer this one.
Yeah, I will do, but by normal way, I'm just going to answer provide a little bit of information on what Ibu really said as well, if that's okay. But it's a great question in both senses, and one of the most exciting things about being a coral biologist is this is a period of, it's a period that we need to be very concerned about, and obviously we need to focus on protection. But it's also a period that should be of great discovery. There's new technologies out there that allow us to explore places that we never were able to before. We have deep sea submersibles now, then we're getting much more accurate maps of deep reefs, and the opportunity to find new species is significant. If you look at the estimated species richness of corals, they're orders of magnitude out. We just don't know what's there. There are new molecular tools that we can use. It's called environmental DNA, where we can profile water and find out the DNA fragments in the water to tell us what's there, even if we can't see it. So it was a great question, and I'd see it as a great opportunity to find species. If we don't apply the precautionary principle of protecting the oceans, we're not going to even know what we don't know. And, that's a terrible position for us to be. The second question was also a great question, and I completely understand why that's being asked. Generally speaking, we focus on, whenever we're restoring a system, be it seagrasses, mangroves, coral reefs, or tropical rainforests, we focus on the key ecosystem architects. So that's the key species that provide the framework for the habitat that underpins the whole ecological structure. So in that sense, think of if you were to, what's the first thing you would do if you to build a new city? You would build new houses, accommodation, office blocks. You build the infrastructure. So by putting the hard corals in there, we're putting back the sort of fundamental infrastructure that then allows other species to come in. In some cases that we do restore soft corals, but generally we found that they've naturally recruited on their own. The major problem is the hard corals, and they're the most important to provide the architecture needed to support other species. So that's the reasons why we focus on those key ecosystem architects.
Thank you. Hope Izat Nugraha from the Zoom room got the answer and happy about this one. We have interesting question again. I think this is more going toward Ibu Rili and Professor David. Welcome to also explain about this. Rafi from using Instagram. How does Indonesia protect the overall environment, and who are the key actors that need to be involved in saving our reefs?
Great question, Rafi. Thank you. Terima kasih banyak. I think, yeah, the key actors in our what we've seen so far, in our experience with CTC and other programs, is that communities living in and around, marine protected areas and near coral reef ecosystems, they really have to be engaged in caring for the ecosystems. Often they actually know a lot already about those uh, ecosystems, and they need to be more provided training and more empowered to actually care for those ecosystems. And of course, very important that the national government, particularly the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, has set out a very ambitious goal to set aside 32.5 million hectares of marine waters in marine protected areas by 2030. And Indonesia is doing very well it is very well on their way to achieve this objective, this goal. And it's about 10% of Indonesia's total marine waters. And we help the government uh, with a roadmap towards this vision and how they could achieve it in terms of, for example, planning with budgets, what kind of capacity we need to build within the government, with communities, with dive operators. These are also key actors to become involved in caring for the ecosystems, monitoring as well, but also looking at regulatory frameworks, the financing of conservation, but also looking at communications issues like how do you raise the awareness of the importance of coral reefs around the archipelago. So it's a combination of strategies that is led by the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries as well as Environment. And the mandate at the moment is with the provincial government. But it's really a teamwork, a collaboration between communities, government, and the private sector, as well as, of course, NGOs, to address this problem. And I think Indonesia, I've been working in this field now for 30 years. It's great to see much more interest and commitment towards oceans. In the 80s, it was all focused on the tropical rainforest, and now we have great strategies and a dedicated ministry, so many more NGOs, and especially the young people are so much more involved in marine conservation. So I'm hopeful, and I think Indonesia is well on the way with a lot of support from USAID and other groups to achieve its goals. Very much aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the Convention on Marine Biodiversity, on biodiversity in general. Thank you.
Prof. David, do you have any additional answer to that one? You're still mute, I think.
You think I'd be used to that by now, wouldn't you? After all these 2 years of Zoom. Sorry about that. As I was saying, I think Ira really covered it really nicely. Now, I particularly liked the fact that she put, obviously the local communities right at the heart of the issues there, and that's really important to government. And also, she mentioned the private sector. Now, I span two worlds really. I'm a university professor, but I've also worked in a private organisation as well. Um, and I would try and just emphasize the role that private organizations can play in active coral conservation and marine protection. And it doesn't have to be necessarily just those actors who utilizing that system, because we all depend on the health of the ocean for a healthy life, and the health of the ocean requires a healthy reef, and Indonesia has the most reefs. So it's kind of all our responsibility in private organizations to be involved, but particularly those private companies that have historically benefited from marine resources, even if they're not directly coral reef. Coral reefs support and underpin marine productivity and biodiversity across the planet, well, particularly the tropics. So I would really encourage private organizations to do more. I think generally speaking, there is capital there to be able to invest. And if that investment is done effectively, then and in collaboration with others, then we can really start to change and turn the tide. And I think probably our relationship between us at Mars, the universities, CTC, Bloomberg, national parks, and government authority, isn't that an example of how we should all be working together to solve a common problem? We all have different perspectives, granted, but we all respect each other and can communicate to identify where exactly we should be traveling, in which direction. And I think that's a good example of how we can move forward for sure.
Surely. So it's actually a combination of government, community, both the youth one, including the youth one, and the private sectors, NGO should work together to conserve to protect our reefs. Yeah. Thank you, Ibu Rili and Professor David. We also have another question from Giselle through Instagram. The question is, beside the beauty of corals and plants on the bottom of the sea, is it true sea and ocean also the source of food for mankind in the future? Can you give us a little bit information on this?
I can go if you like, but probably see similar things. Then I can't imagine a future planet that doesn't depend on fish from the ocean. And I think there is lots of great examples where fish can be sustainable, but there's probably many examples as well where it's not sustainable. So the future, I can't see a future without fish. Now the argument comes whether or not, as a society, we move from pure extraction of wild types, the sort of hunting type approach of fisheries, or we start to farm the ocean more effectively. Now we've seen that on land, of course, as populations rise and settle, and agriculture, the Green Revolution. Is there going to be a similar brew revolution? If we do go down that route and we start to utilize much more farmed products, we really need to make sure we learn the lessons from the past and we don't start causing more environmental degradation as we have done in other systems. Aquaculture, I think, has great opportunities to help provide protein for those who need it most in the areas that need it. So I think there is a future of wild type fishing, but I think it'll probably go down as we learn that we have to extract less in a more sustainable manner. I think aquaculture, mariculture will expand, but we really have to be careful we do so using the best possible environmental principles and we don't go too far too quick.
Good one. Ibu really wants to add?
Yeah, well said, David. Not much to add there. I think I mentioned in my presentation that a healthy reef can generate 5 to 10 tons of fish per square kilometer, which is incredible. So it brings back home the message again how important it is to protect the coral reefs, as they are the habitat of many of the reef species and fish species that we eat, all over the world. And so having marine protected areas as a key tool to protect our fish stock so you can actually sustain fisheries for future generations is such an important um, initiative, I think, that is embraced by the Indonesian government. But it does take the engagement again of communities, government, private sector, NGOs to collaborate together. And I agree with David that our collaboration with Mars and other groups on coral restoration is one of those examples where we all unite to preserve the oceans. So I really hope with this webinar we can also instill more, inspirational actions from the audience and also from more groups in Indonesia and around the globe. And please help us to spread the message about the importance of coral reef conservation. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we we have one last question. I think it's come from me, Professor David, and also one of the participants also having similar question about volunteerism. But my question is actually for those who want to join the coral restoration with you, for example, for this project, what is the requirement or the skill set they have to be joining that one, and how is the process for joining volunteerism if there's any?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've done a few webinars and been asked similar in different parts of the world, which is really interesting. You do a similar webinar in the UK, and you get asked the similar sort of questions, and it's great that people from different backgrounds really want to do this. At the moment, and I'm going to be completely honest with you, we don't have an access route into what we do. We've primarily focused on trying to train sort of the stakeholders who have responsibility to protect and restore their environment. But we have to find a vehicle to sort of capitalize on the enthusiasm and the motivation of individuals to be involved. And maybe I'm saying it live, really, maybe there's something that you and I should put our mind to see whether there were not greater opportunities to allow people to get actively involved. The active participation really consolidates strong, long-term, sustainable conservation principles. That's really important. And secondly, there's more reefs that need help than we could ever do on our own. So the more bodies we got to do it, the better. But unfortunately, we have to be honest, we don't have in the Mars perspective, at least, a route to get involved. But I can assure you, we shall be putting it on our list of things to do shortly.
All right. So if you want to elaborate like skill set, do they have to be
Oh yeah, so sorry.
dive or
Well,
the snorkeling?
yeah, well, obviously, I would encourage everyone to get in the water, have a look. Let's hope you can swim first before you throw yourself in the water. But certainly, and particularly if this is, I didn't get who the question was from someone in Indonesia, I think, then you have the most beautiful environments on the planet. I've been fortunate enough to visit many, but Indonesia is number one. So, definitely I would encourage individuals to snorkel and if they can dive. In terms of the skill sets needed for restoration, as I think I showed in the Mars approach and in other approaches, there's several different ways in which you can assist by actually, producing the materials on land to actively get in the water. So there's a wide range of skills and a wide range of opportunities. And you don't probably even have to get your foot wet to actually have a benefit for restoration. You can help with communications and spreading the word. If you were to be that individual who wanted to do all of it, then you would be a qualified scuba diver, confident in the water, and able to undertake a physical activity. If you had some formal education in marine biology, that would be great, but it's not essential because you get trained on the job. So that would be the answer, I think.
Okay. Thank you. So that's the basic skill set they have to have, yeah, to be competent to be able to join this coral restoration or even the reef health monitoring in our site, yeah, Bu really?
Yes, absolutely. But everyone can, submit their interest through our website. There is a link, and if you like to volunteer or do an internship, let us know, and we'll see how we can accommodate that at our sites or at the center. Thank you.
Thank you, Bu really. Okay, we still have one question from YouTube channel that we have. Here's from Bapak Permana Yudiarso. He said, "Hi all. There were reports on coral bleaching in Bali, West Nusa Tenggara in 2020 by BPSPL dan Pasar. How the best solution to handle by local community at field in dealing with the coral bleaching?"
Is this one for you or for me? If we really, I don't mind.
Oh, it's okay. I'm happy. Selamat malam, Pak Yudi. We have a great collaboration with Pak Yudi also, and working together on coral restoration. So it's great if the community in West Bali can first of all document the amount of the extent of bleaching, um, what happened there, and do an assessment around the area, what the causes could be, because bleaching can have several causes, also very much by local stressors, and provide if they can, documentation also with photos underwater if they have cameras as well. And ideally, they could set aside an area, if possible, that could be eligible for coral restoration, and set aside an area for a marine protected area to look at those reefs that are actually withstanding certain temperature rise, or the um, perhaps the pollution disturbance that caused this coral bleaching, and protect those reefs or coral colonies that actually are not bleaching. So this comes back to Parrot's presentation in terms of identifying the surviving communities and ensure that these are well protected, and at the same time perhaps help with some restoration for the bleached corals at that area. But that would be my immediate advice to the community.
Right. Prof. David, do you have any more answer to this? Additional
No, that was a
one?
complete answer. I totally agree. As soon as the speaker, you asked the question, I was thinking, ooh, which one survived? Think of it in the opposite way because that's the exciting part. Although obviously I'm be
Yeah.
devastated that other corals are dying, but look for the survivors and see if we can harvest them. That's what my yeah.
Yeah. So the key message is actually focus on survivors. Yeah, as mentioned
Yeah.
by all three of our panelists. So before we are almost reaching the end of this session, we would like to ask for your final statement, Ibu Rili, Prof. David, before ending of this session. Maybe we start from Ibu Rili for your closing statement. Ibu, silakan.
Terima kasih, Hesti. Well, my closing statement is that I hope you all are more inspired to become a steward or a champion for coral reef conservation. I cannot stress again how important coral reefs are, and Indonesia's richness in coral reefs and our heritage, marine heritage that we can all conserve together. So I hope to see you all welcome you at the center, and join forces in preserving the most diverse reefs on Earth in Indonesia and the Coral Triangle region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibu. The next one is Professor David.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just like to reiterate that coral reefs are essential for the health of the world's oceans, and health of the oceans is required for a healthy planet. You cannot divorce that. Indonesia is by far the most biodiverse reef systems in the world. It's of global significance, and I think Indonesian countries should be very proud of their natural resources. But with that becomes some level of responsibility. But I would say to the listeners, although we are bombarded with lots of bad news about the demise of reefs, remember there is hope. There is opportunities for us to reverse the trend if we all work together in collaboration across cultures, across age groups, for a common goal. And that common goal should be to preserve, protect, and restore coral reefs for the future of our planet.
Thank you, Prof. David. So those are I think that's the key messages that we want to take home from the Fight for the Ocean Session 1, Coral Reefs and Climate Change. Thank you very much, Ibu. Really, Professor David, thank you very much for everyone who's joining this session and raising lots of interesting questions related to our today topic. Um, let's join us in the next session on February 16, the same time, 6:30 p.m. on Perspective from the Frontliners. It is one we will hear more from the community on the ground talking about marine protected area, which is one of the tools to conserve, taking care of the corals, but also for sustaining the fish stock for food security. Thank you very much for your all participation. I'll see you again in the next session. I'm Hesti Widodo saying good night, selamat malam, selamat istirahat. Hopefully all the things are inspired to take action right now.
All right. Thank you very much to our speakers today, Professor David, Bu Rili, and also Dr. Rod, along with our moderator, Dr. Hesti. Thank you so much for today's discussion. I hope that everyone gained a lot of insights and knowledge. Also, I hope that everyone enjoyed the event as much as we did. Now, earlier in the session, we asked audience members a trivia question, and that question was, which of the following is an impact of climate change in coral reef ecosystems? And the correct answer to that is D, all of the above. Shout out goes out to Aka Gibran from Instagram for answering the question correctly. And thank you to everyone else who has also participated. Now you may be wondering, how can I develop an awesome idea for Ad America? It's very easy. You can go to our website at www.atamerica.org.id, and then you can select create an event and collaborate with us. All event proposals coming to us will be reviewed, and your event might be featured with us soon. Also, don't forget to follow us on our social medias on Instagram, Twitter, and also Facebook at AT America for our event updates and a lot more fun content. Don't forget as well to subscribe to our newsletter and YouTube channel for more content. With that, I think it is time to say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. My name is Genara, and see you soon at the next Ad America event. Good night.